Boar stared at the frost-crusted ground and wondered how anyone could sleep without turning into an icicle. The answer lies not in magic, but in clever, low-tech insulation strategies that our Paleolithic ancestors honed over tens of thousands of years. First, they built their shelters where nature already offered a blanket. In the Upper Paleolithic, people chose caves with deep recesses that stayed above 0 degrees C even when the outside dipped to 40 degrees C. The stone walls absorbed daytime solar heat and released it slowly through the night, creating a thermal inertia that kept the interior from freezing solid. Where caves were unavailable, they dug semi-subterranean pits or constructed mammoth skin tents partially buried in snow. The earth itself acts as an excellent insulator. A few centimeters of packed snow can actually be warmer than the air because the trapped air pockets limit heat loss. Inside these shelters, the real secret was layering. Archaeologists have found evidence of multiple bedding layers, a base of pine bark or dry grasses topped with a thick mat of animal hides, then a feather or fur covering. Each layer traps air, and air is a poor conductor of heat. Experiments with replica sites show that such a 3-layer system can retain up to 80% of body heat, keeping the sleeper's core temperature around 36 degrees C even when the wind outside is 30 degrees C. Fire, of course, added another crucial layer of warmth. But fire alone isn't enough. It creates convection currents that can actually draw heat away if the shelter is poorly sealed. Paleolithic dwellings often featured low entrances, sometimes covered with a windbreak of stones or packed snow, so that the warm air stayed inside and the cold air stayed out. Charred hearths found in sites like Dolny Vestanis show they were built on raised platforms of stones, which prevented the fire from smothering the bedding and allowed a steady, radiant heat source. People also used their own bodies as heat sources. In winter camps, families would sleep in close proximity, sometimes even huddling with newborns under a shared hide blanket. This communal warmth, called social thermoregulation, is documented in ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers and likely existed in the Ice Age as well. A single adult can produce about 100 watts of heat. A small group can generate enough combined output to raise the temperature inside a small tent by several degrees. Finally, they protected their extremities with fur-lined gloves, moccasin-type footwear, and head coverings made from reindeer or bison hide. The ears and nose were often wrapped in fur strips, because even a few millimeters of insulated tissue can prevent frostbite and reduce overall heat loss. All these techniques, strategic shelter placement, layered bedding, controlled fire placement, communal sleeping, and insulated clothing, work together like a primitive but highly effective heating system. Scientists who reconstruct Paleolithic dwellings with modern thermal imaging consistently find that these methods could keep a person comfortably warm for weeks on end, even in the harshest glacial climates. So, the next time you shiver in a cold snap, remember that our ancestors didn't need high-tech jackets. They just knew how to turn nature's own materials into a life-sustaining blanket. How did our Ice Age ancestors manage to get any shut-eye when the temperature outside plummeted to -40 degrees and the wind howled like a pack of wolves? The answer isn't a magic insulated sleeping bag, it's a series of clever, cold-proof positions and simple tools that turned a frozen cave into a surprisingly warm bedroom. First, scientists studying the bone chemistry and the wear patterns on the teeth of late Pleistocene Homo sapiens and Neanderthals have found that they often curled up in a fetal position, tucking their heads into the crook of their arms. This reduces the surface area exposed to the cold air and conserves body heat, much like a cat does when it curls into a ball. In many cave sites, archaeologists have uncovered clusters of stone sleeping platforms, flat slabs of limestone or packed earth that were smoothed by repeated use. By lying on these slightly elevated surfaces, the sleepers avoided direct contact with the damp, icy ground, which would otherwise draw heat away through conduction. A second trick involved using natural blankets. Layers of animal skins, especially those from bison, reindeer, or mammoth, were draped over the body and tucked under the chin. These hides retain a remarkable amount of trapped air, acting as an early form of insulation. In some sites, like the famous Kostenki complex in Russia, hundreds of tiny perforations have been found on mammoth hide fragments, indicating they were stitched together with sinew to create a makeshift quilt. But the real game changer was fire and its clever storage. When the night fell, the group would build a small, low-oxygen ember pit at the back of the shelter. The ember's radiant heat radiated gently across the sleeping area without the risk of a raging blaze. Charcoal, which retains heat for hours, was often spread in a thin layer under the sleeping platform. Experiments by experimental archaeologists have shown that a thin charcoal blanket can keep the surface temperature several degrees above the ambient air for up to 8 hours. Finally, positioning within the cave mattered. Researchers have mapped the airflow in several Ice Age caves and found that the deepest chambers stay warmer because cold air, being denser, sinks and flows out through lower entrances, while the warmer, lighter air stays trapped higher up. By setting up their sleeping spots near the ceiling of these chambers and using a few large stones as windbreaks, our ancestors created microclimates where the temperature could be a full 10 degrees warmer than the outside world. So, when you hear a story about a frozen world where people just froze to death, remember that they weren't just lying there helpless. They curled up, layered themselves in skin, built low-oxygen ember pits, spread charcoal, and chose the warmest nook of the cave. All of these low-tech, high-effectiveness hacks turned a night at -40 into a survivable slumber, proving once again that necessity is the mother of invention even in the deep freeze of the Ice Age. How did Neanderthals keep a fire going when the temperature dropped to 40 degrees C and the wind howled through their ice-capped valleys? The answer isn't a mystical magic stone, but a suite of gritty, low-tech tricks that archaeologists have pieced together from hearth-filled cave sites, charred bone, and the occasional preserved piece of tinder. First, they chose their camp locations with a keen eye for natural shelter. A shallow cave or a rock overhang not only blocked the worst of the wind, it also created a microclimate that stayed a few degrees warmer than the open tundra. Inside those shelters, the Neanderthals built a low, semicircular pit, what we call a fire pit, lined with stones that absorbed heat during the day and radiated it through the night, much like a primitive heat sink. The real secret, though, lies in how they started the fire and kept it alive. Flint knapping was a daily ritual. They struck high-quality flint against pyrite to produce sparks, then caught those sparks on a bundle of dry, resin-rich plant fibers, commonly cattail down, dried grass, or inner bark from birch. Experiments at the University of Durham have shown that a single spark can ignite such tinder in under a second if it's properly pre-dried, and Neanderthals were masters at keeping their tinder dry even in damp conditions, storing it in hollowed-out bark or in the dry shelter of a rock crevice. Once the flame was lit, they fed it with a carefully selected mix of fuel. Large pieces of wood, oak, pine, or birch, provided long-lasting heat, while smaller, resin-laden sticks acted as accelerants, creating a hotter, more stable core. Charcoal, which they produced by partially burning wood in low-oxygen conditions, was also a key resource. Charcoal burns hotter and longer than raw wood, and because it can be broken into small, transportable pieces, Neanderthals could stash it in stone-capped pits or even in the walls of their dwellings. These hidden, fuel caches were essentially ancient fire banks, allowing them to rekindle a fire without starting from scratch each night. But the brilliance didn't stop at storage. To prevent the fire from sputtering out during fierce blizzards, Neanderthals built windbreaks from packed snow or stone slabs around the hearth, creating a sheltered pocket of air that the flame could draw from. They also employed a technique known as flame tending. A designated member of the group, often an elder with the most experience, would constantly tend to the embers, adding small twigs and shifting the stones to maintain an even heat distribution. This continuous attention meant that the fire never truly died. Even a faint ember could be coaxed back to life with a few fresh sparks. Evidence of these practices comes from sites like the El Moyen Cave in France, where layers of ash and charcoal are interspersed with stone-lined fire pits, and from the famous Neanderthal fireplace at the Shanidar 4 burial, where a ring of stones still holds a faint soot-stained outline after tens of thousands of years. Microscopic analysis of the soot shows multiple heating cycles, indicating that the fire was reignited many times without a full rebuild. In short, Neanderthals weren't just lucky survivors. They were engineers of heat, using simple materials, clever placement, and relentless maintenance to keep a fire burning through the darkest, coldest months of the Ice Age. How did Ice Age hunters keep their meat from turning into a mushy mess before the next hunt? The answer isn't a high-tech freezer, but a clever use of the world's most reliable refrigerator, the permafrost itself. Picture a small band of Neanderthals or early modern humans huddled in a rocky shelter at the edge of a glacial valley. The wind howls, temperatures plunge to -40 degrees, and the group has just bagged a bison, a reindeer, or a mammoth. Their stomachs are full, but the rest of the kill is a ticking time bomb. If they eat it all at once, they'll starve later. If they leave it exposed, it will spoil or attract wolves. So they turn the landscape into a natural cold store. Archaeologists have found clear evidence of cold storage pits in sites like the upper Paleolithic layers of Kostenki in Russia and the Magdalenian caves of southern France. Hunters dug shallow depressions in the ground, sometimes lining them with stone slabs or compacted earth to keep the bottom dry. Then they packed the cut meat into these pits, covering it with a thick layer of insulating material, often a blanket of moss, bark, or even snow. In the dead of winter, the ground temperature several centimeters below the surface stayed well below freezing, even when air temperature fluctuated. This allowed the meat to remain frozen for weeks, sometimes months. In some cases, they used the natural ice that formed in cracks of frozen streams. By dragging a slab of meat onto a sheet of river ice and covering it with a layer of animal fat, they created a makeshift ice box that resisted thawing during the brief daylight hours. Experimental archaeology shows that a few centimeters of animal fat act like a thermal barrier, slowing heat transfer enough to keep meat solid for the length of a typical hunting season. When the weather warmed in spring, hunters would retrieve the stored flesh, scrape off the outer crust of frost, and slice away any portions that had begun to decay. Even in the absence of refrigeration, the cold environment allowed them to preserve high-protein food, essential for surviving lean periods when game was scarce. The practice of seasonal caching also meant that groups could plan migrations more strategically, moving to new hunting grounds while leaving a food bank behind for those who stayed. Scientists believe that this cold storage strategy was a key factor in the success of Homo neanderthalensis and early Homo sapiens during the last glacial maximum. It required knowledge of local microclimates, the ability to dig and cover pits efficiently, and a social structure that could protect and manage the caches from scavengers. The very act of storing meat also fostered cooperation. Multiple families would pool their kills, creating communal reserves that could sustain entire bands through harsh winters. So next time you think of freezers as a modern convenience, remember that our ancestors were already mastering the art of refrigeration tens of thousands of years ago, using nothing more than a hole in the ground, a handful of moss, and the relentless chill of the Ice Age itself. How did a hunter-gatherer with a gash on his thigh keep bleeding out when there were no band-aids, no antibiotics, and no sterile clinics? The answer lies in a toolbox of plant chemistry, clever pressure tricks, and a deep knowledge passed down through generations. Anthropologists working at sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic and the Kalahari still find cut marks on bones that line up with healed wounds, evidence that prehistoric people actually survived serious injuries. First, the most immediate threat was blood loss. The simplest technique was tourniquet-style pressure. A strip of bark, a woven grass cord, or even a piece of rawhide was wrapped tightly above the wound to slow the flow. Experiments by the University of Zurich's Living Past project showed that a 3-centimeter wide bark strip, soaked in water to increase flexibility, can reduce arterial bleeding by up to 80% within seconds. Once the bleeding slowed, the wound was cleaned with whatever antiseptic plants were at hand. In the temperate zones of Europe, the bark of willow, Salix spp, was a favorite. It contains salicin, a natural precursor to aspirin, which reduces inflammation and helps clotting. Archaeobotanical residues on stone tools from the Lascaux caves contain willow compounds, suggesting they were chewed or crushed and applied as a poultice. In the African savannas, the leaves of the wild tobacco plant, Nicotiana paniculata, were mashed into a paste. Its nicotine acts as a mild antiseptic, killing surface bacteria. Likewise, the crushed roots of yarrow, Achillea millefolium, were spread over cuts. Modern studies confirm yarrow's antimicrobial peptides inhibit Staphylococcus aureus. If the wound was deeper, a secondary layer of protection was added. Charred wood chips, cooled and then packed around the injury, created a dry, slightly acidic environment that discourages bacterial growth. Charcoal's porous structure also soaks up excess exudate, acting like an ancient, dry dressing. In the colder months, a layer of animal fat, rendered from a hunted elk, was smeared over the bandage. The fat sealed the wound from wind and dirt while providing a slow-release source of vitamin D, which aids immune function. Healing wasn't just about the wound itself, community played a crucial role. Ethnographic studies of the Sand People show that tending was a group activity. While one member applied the plant paste, others kept the patient warm, using shared fire heat or insulated animal hides. This social support reduced shock and kept the body's core temperature stable, a factor scientists now know speeds clot formation. Finally, the knowledge of when to let a wound air out versus when to keep it moist was surprisingly sophisticated. In the arid steppes of Mongolia, hunters left small lacerations uncovered for short periods to form a scab, then reapplied a thin layer of crushed pine resin, rich in terpenes that prevent fungal invasion. This alternating moist-dry regimen mirrors modern, wet-to-dry dressing changes. All of these practices, pressure, plant antiseptics, charcoal or fat dressings, and communal care, show that prehistoric people weren't just lucky, they built a practical, evidence-based medical system using the resources around them. Scientists today still test these ancient recipes, and many prove to be genuinely effective, confirming that the survival of our ancestors often hinged on a clever blend of chemistry, physics, and teamwork, not on mysticism. How did ancient humans keep the nighttime predators at bay when a saber-toothed cat prowled just beyond the fire's glow? The answer lies in the quiet authority of the elders, the true guardians of the hearth. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of stone tools with wear patterns that match repeated, coordinated thrusts, evidence that these weapons weren't just for hunting large game, but also for practice drills. Ethnographic analogs from modern hunter-gatherer societies, such as the Kung and the Inuit, show that older members of the band spend hours each day teaching youngsters the kill and cover routine, how to hold a spear low, how to thrust with the point aimed at the animal's throat, and how to keep the butt of the spear planted to block a charging predator. In the chilly corridors of a cave dwelling, the elders would gather the children around a low, smoldering fire, the heat keeping their hands from numbing. They'd first demonstrate the spear wall technique using wooden shafts wrapped in animal hide for safety. Then the youths would pair off, each holding a spear at a 45-degree angle, stepping forward and backward in a rhythm that mimics the predator's lunge. Researchers studying cut marks on Pleistocene megafauna bones have noted a consistent pattern of shallow, repeated incisions, exactly the sort of damage a trained band could inflict before the animal's massive forelimbs could strike. Older women, too, played a vital role. Cave art from sites like Lascaux shows women wielding long, curved wooden staffs, suggesting they participated in defensive drills alongside men. Their participation reinforced the idea that every adult, regardless of gender, was a potential shield for the group. When a real saber-tooth appeared, its massive canines flashing in the firelight, the trained youths would form a semicircle, spears angled outward, while the elders positioned themselves at the center, ready to step in if a predator slipped through a gap. This formation created a human fence, a tactic confirmed by experimental archaeology projects that use replica spears and participants to simulate predator attacks. The result? A dramatically higher success rate in repelling the animal and a lower chance of anyone being seriously injured. What's fascinating is the way knowledge was encoded in story as well as in muscle memory. Elders told vivid cautionary tales. The night the cat's whiskers brushed the moon, to embed the fear of the predator and the necessity of vigilance in the younger generation's psyche. These narratives weren't myth, they were practical mnemonics, reinforcing the timing of the drills. The first thrust at the moment the predator's shoulders rose, the second thrust as its head lowered. Over generations, this cultural transmission created a sort of collective immune system against saber-toothed cats, turning what could have been a lethal surprise into a predictable, rehearsed encounter. So when you imagine a Paleolithic camp under a star-filled sky, picture not only the crackle of fire, but also the steady cadence of elders and children moving in unison, spears clacking against one another, all rehearsing the dance that kept the most fearsome predator of the Ice Age at arm's length. Their disciplined training, grounded in real tool use and reinforced by communal storytelling, was the real reason those early peoples could survive the age of the saber-toothed cat. How could a newborn survive in a cave that feels like a freezer? That's the question that keeps archaeologists up at night when they stare at the tiny, carefully shaped femur fragments from the Upper Paleolithic sites of France and Spain. The answer is a mix of biology, social cooperation, and a whole lot of ingenuity. First, let's talk about the birth itself. Even though the Ice Age mothers were likely shorter and less robust than modern women, their pelvic anatomy was essentially the same. human evolution hasn't altered that basic design for tens of thousands of years. The real challenge was the temperature. Evidence from Hearth remains in the Chauvet and Lascaux caves shows that fire pits were set up right at the entrance of the sleeping chambers, creating a microclimate that stayed a few degrees above freezing. Scientists believe that a constant low-level flame, fed by dry wood or bone charcoal, could keep the air around the birthing mat at roughly 5–10 degrees C, cold, but survivable for a naked infant whose brown fat was already producing heat. Breastfeeding was the next lifeline. Milk is a perfect, calorie-dense food, and it also provides antibodies that protect the child from the bacteria thriving in damp caves. Dental microwear analysis of Neanderthal infants shows that they were nursing for up to 3 years, a period longer than most modern mammals. The mother's diet, rich in protein from large game meat and omega-3s from fish, translated into richer, more nutritious milk. But a mother can't do it alone. Cave paintings and wear patterns on stone slabs reveal designated nursery spots, often near the fire but away from the main work area. Older siblings and especially grandmothers were key participants. Ethnographic parallels with modern hunter-gatherer societies show that grandmothers contributed food, kept watch for predators, and taught infants how to handle cold, wrapping them in furs, rocking them in animal skins, and even gently massaging them to stimulate circulation. When the little one did get sick, a common risk in a damp, bacteria-laden environment, caregivers turned to natural remedies. Charcoal from the hearth was powdered and mixed with water to create a poultice that could draw out infection. Spruce resin, found in copal deposits, was applied to cuts as an antiseptic. These treatments weren't magic, but they reduced bacterial load enough for the immune system to catch up. Finally, the social structure itself acted as a thermostat. The group's daily routine, rotating shifts at the fire, sharing blankets made from reindeer hide, and keeping the newborn close during the coldest hours, ensured that no child ever froze alone. In the Ice Age world, the survival of a single infant depended on the entire tribe's willingness to keep the fire burning, the furs warm, and the love flowing. And that, my friends, is how a tiny human could be born, fed, and raised in a sub-zero cave without a single modern gadget in sight. How could a hunter-gatherer know that a fever wasn't just the wind's chill, and what could they do when the cold itself turned into a silent killer? That's the puzzle researchers have been piecing together from frost-crusted teeth, buried hearths, and the occasional preserved skin from permafrost sites. The first clue is simple. Early humans were extraordinarily attuned to their own bodies. When a member of a band started shivering beyond the normal "I'm cold" response, or developed a cough that lingered after a day of tracking elk, the group noticed. In the archaeological record, we see clusters of burials with signs of respiratory disease, thickened rib bones, calcified lesions in the lungs, often dated to the height of the last glacial maximum. Those individuals weren't just sick. They were the kind of people who probably spent extra time near the fire, their bodies telling the rest of the tribe, "I need help." Detecting illness was a matter of observation and ritual. A common practice, documented in ethnographic accounts of recent Arctic peoples, was the fire check. Before bedtime, the group would huddle around the central blaze, and anyone who looked pale, sweated profusely, or breathed with a labored wheeze was asked to sit closer to the flames. The fire's heat was both diagnostic and therapeutic. It raised core temperature, helped melt the icy secretions clogging the lungs, and gave the sick person a chance to rest without the constant threat of hypothermia. Treatment, of course, was limited to what nature provided. Charred bark, pine resin, and the ash of certain mosses were boiled into a gritty broth. When the soup cooled, the steam carried antimicrobial compounds, phenols from spruce, for instance, into the airway. Archaeologists have found residues of pine resin in stone mortars from sites like Kostenki in Russia, suggesting that these early soup doctors knew that the smell of resin could clear sinuses. In addition, they chewed the inner bark of willow, which contains salicin, a natural precursor to aspirin. The bitter taste wasn't a pleasure, but it reduced fever and eased joint pain caused by lingering infections. Another line of defense came from the very animals they hunted. Inuit oral histories tell of seal oil patches, small amounts of seal blubber applied to wounds or rubbed on the chest to ease coughing. Seal oil is rich in omega-3 fatty acids and vitamin D, both of which support immune function. Microscopic analysis of residue on bone needles from a 20,000-year-old site in the Altai Mountains shows traces of marine fats, suggesting that similar practices may have existed far earlier than previously thought. When the illness was severe, the tribe's social structure provided a safety net. Older members, who, despite their age, often carried the most knowledge of medicinal plants, were given priority access to the fire and the best portions of the broth. In many cases, the sick were carried on sleds made of animal hide and insulated with layers of moss, keeping them from the wind while they were transported back to the main shelter. This communal care dramatically increased survival odds. Statistical models based on burial data indicate that groups with a higher proportion of elders had up to a 15% lower mortality rate during cold snaps. Finally, prevention was woven into daily life. Early humans built semi-subterranean houses, essentially earth-covered pits with a low entrance, so that cold air stayed outside while the interior retained the warmth of the hearth. They also used animal skins as insulation, tucking them between layers of grass and furs to line sleeping platforms. By keeping the body dry and the shelter draft-free, they reduced the incidence of pneumonia and other lung infections that could turn a simple cold into a deadly bout of snow-borne illness. So, while they didn't have antibiotics or vaccines, ancient peoples fought the silent killer with keen observation. Fire-centered care, natural remedies drawn from bark, resin, and seal oil, and a tightly knit social fabric that made sure no one, no matter how sick, was left out in the cold.